All right, everybody. Thank you for joining us this evening. I'm Jean Paul from Space Cowboy Books, and tonight we are celebrating the Writers of the Future number 36 anthology with two of this year's winners, both Zack Be and Storm Humbert. And I'm going to get into their bios so you can learn a little bit about them. They're going to share some of the readings of these winning stories. And then we're going to get into a little bit of a Q&A and interview. If anyone has questions that they'd like to ask the authors, please put them in the chat room and we'll try to get to everybody's questions. So tonight we'll be talking with Zack Be. He is a writer, musician, PhD student, and a couple and family therapist trapped forever in the gravity well of the Washington, D.C. area. When he isn't working, writing, or gigging with his bands, or otherwise agreeing to participate in exciting projects he doesn't have time for, the overworked and underslept master of none plays with his dog, Misty, grapples with Brazilian jiu-jitsu gym, and generally tries to avoid the clarion call of web surfing lollygags. Zack's fiction has been published in Asimov's Science Fiction and Writers of the Future 36. His new novelette, Pull It From the Root, will appear in the November-December 2020 issue of Asimov's Fiction. Perfectly innocuous about his writing career and music can be found at zackbe.com. And we're also joined tonight by Storm Humbert, and he is a 31-year-old writer from Fayette, Ohio, a one-stoplight town near the Michigan border. He earned his MFA at Temple University, where he had the good fortune to study with a number of great instructors, including Samuel R. Delany. He is currently a legal writer working in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and lives with his girlfriend Casey in Westland. Storm is also a slush reader for Clark's World magazine, and his work has been published in Andromeda Spaceways, Apex Magazine, Interzone, and others. Most recently, Storm was a winner of the 2019 Writers of the Future contest, so his winning story can be found in this year's anthology. More information about Storm, as well as links to his work, can be found at his site, stormhumbertwrites.com, and I'll be posting both those links in the chat if anyone wants to check them out. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to the writers. Storm, would you like to go first and share a little bit of your story with us?
Sure. My story is Stolen Sky. It's further on in the anthology, and it has, trying to get the illustration up here real quick. It is illustrated by An Lee. This is his illustration for my story. It was interesting to see his illustration considering he depicted a character I did not describe, so that was fun. Let's see. I'll just start from the beginning and I'll read a couple sections. Stolen Sky. My first night on Earth Vega was also my first sunset show. The viewing was held on the sunset mezzanine, which jutted out from the third floor of the hotel. My human guide, Ruya, gently escorted me through the press of humans to the front railing so that I could see, since we Yovani are no larger than human adolescents. From the balcony, the hills seemed to tumble over each other down the gentle grade from the hotel to the edge of the forest, which then climbed gradually up toward the horizon until it terminated at the feet of the distant mountains. The breeze was bracing, but not so cool that I had to turn up the temperature of my garment. It was perfect. Everything the humans made was perfect. For the first night, they chose the sunset of a world called RNA in the Alpha Carinae system. I knew nothing about this world, but I watched in amazement as the sun of Earth Vega became the sun of RNA. When the sun touched the distant peaks, it changed from white to a smoldering orange and shrunk by at least a third. It painted the sky vivid greens and purples. There was no gradient to the shades, no violets, light greens, or near blues. The sky was either emerald or amethyst. The clouds swirled into the shifting colors as the shades swam but never mixed. It was so beautiful that it startled me. I still had so much left to see, not only on Earth Vega, but throughout the galaxy. And I feared nothing would ever measure up to the sunset show, to the first time I saw the humans change the stars. How do you do this? I asked Ruya. He was an attractive man, the kind I and the other Yelvani women would have whispered about when I'd worked on Paradise Yelva, the human resort on my home planet. He had an easy smile that pushed the light from his eyes and warmed whomever he was speaking to. He seemed kind and spoke gently even when I asked him the most useless questions. He tried to explain the Sunset Show, but there were too many words I didn't know and too many things of which I was ignorant. I hadn't been smart enough for the human university on Yelva, and was lucky my Nirma, mother of my father, had taught me to windwrite. The humans loved native art, though some on Yelva said humans loved our native things too much. Why did they choose RNA? I asked. There's a native singer here from RNA, Ruya said. I think his name is Akshat. It's his last night, so the show is for him. I'd never seen any beings besides humans or Yelvani, so I asked Ruya to point out Akshat. The singer was toward the back. He stood as much above the humans as I did below, and his head was as white as a sun-bleached bone, had a prominent ridge that ran from front to back. Akshat's mouth opened into a perfect circle when he spoke, and he stood slumped as if perpetually in the act of being dragged to the ground by his arms. His cheeks seemed heavy too, and his face rested in a frown. It was difficult to tell if he enjoyed the show. After dinner, I attended Akshat's last performance. Rui and I sat in a private balcony with a perfect view of the stage and the tables of humans below. I was surprised when Akshat sang his native language, but when I asked why this was, Rui said it was expected because humans love the authenticity. I still wished I could understand the words, but I wanted to learn to appreciate authenticity as well. I had so much to learn from the humans. I also found that even though I couldn't understand the words, Akshat's voice was show enough. The lower tones crouched in the air and rumbled in my body, while the higher notes filled the room to the lofty ceiling and shook the light as it clattered and tinkled through the crystalline fixtures. Some parts of the song seemed silent, but Rhea said those notes were simply beyond human or Yelvani hearing. I wondered if he and I missed the same parts, or if we experienced different sections of the song, but I didn't ask. Once the show was over, however, I did ask Rhea if it was possible for me to meet Akshat. Of course, he said, through his warm smile. He stood and extended his hand. Let's find his guide and we'll introduce you right now. Akshat stood at the edge of the stage below, shaking hands with some of the humans from the audience. Handshaking was their formal greeting as well as their formal farewell, which I still found confusing, but this was not what I meant when I asked to meet Akshat. Did not want only to have him see my face and hear my name, which seemed to be the purpose of human handshakes. I wanted to meet him as Yelvani do. I wanted to speak to him, to learn about him. Could I meet him privately? I said. I have only ever met humans and Yelvani. I am worried I will act wrongly. Rhea seemed confused and a little worried. He was a kind man. I'll find his guide and see what I can arrange. Stay here. Rhea patted my shoulder as he passed and sealed the clear door of our balcony behind him. The line to meet Akshat dwindled over the next few minutes, and the auditorium was nearly empty by the time he left the stage. Ruya still had not returned, and I stared at that lonely stage for several more minutes after the last human left, cursing myself for not accepting Ruya's initial offer. I nearly jumped from my seat when someone knocked on the door. Akshat towered in the doorway and gestured toward the lock panel for me to let him in. I rushed from my chair to pass my chip over the scanner, but after the door receded into the floor, I had no clue what to do next. I panicked and stuck out my hand. That is for humans, he said, and left my hand unshaken. Instead, he gently touched the ridge on his head with both of his thick fingers, then turned the open palm of his hand toward me. That is how we greet one another on my world. Akshat waited patiently as I stood dumb for a moment, but I eventually understood and extended my nervous fingers toward his face, which I could not reach. I took his hand and placed it on my cheek, and he lowered his head to rest in my palm. His eyes were much smaller than I'd noticed before, and they had large black pupils that went almost corner to corner. He had two small orifices that seemed to do his breathing, tucked in behind the rear undercorners of his jaw, and his skin quivered at my touch, bristling against my flesh like a stone polishing brush. He must have been covered in billions of short, invisible hairs. That is a wonderful greeting, Akshat said. I hope you haven't shown it to a human. May I come in? Of course, I said, confused and still numb to what was happening. I felt as if I was floating through a scene in a human simulator. as if reality could crush the moment in an unforeseeable instant. He pulled a small cube from a crease of his jacket and tossed it onto the floor, where it quickly unfolded and expanded into a chair, the seat of which came to my waist rather than the middle of my legs. An interstellar resort, and all the chairs are made as though only humans will fill them, he said. It makes quite a statement, doesn't it? Oh, I don't know. I felt adrift. With humans I was at least familiar. I could read their expressions and understand what it meant, what was meant or expected. But I couldn't even tell if Akshat was smiling or frowning. I'm sorry, he said, I'm babbling. I hear you wanted to meet me. His expression still told me nothing, but his voice was softer. Yes, I said, I wanted to tell you your song was beautiful. I'm glad you enjoyed it. Akshat sounded rehearsed, but pleasant, as if some germ of earnestness remained from when he used to mean it. We sat in silence for a moment before he said, I don't mean to rush you, but was that all you wanted to say? I'm not sure how much time we have. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt your schedule. Rui said he would check with your guide. You're not interrupting, and your guide did no such thing. Neither he nor my own handler know I'm here. Then how? I heard you. To sing in the full range of sound, one must hear the full range. Not even the best human technology is as sensitive to sound as a fully trained Clashin singer. He seemed to swell in his seat, which made me smile because it was the first time I felt I understood him. Pride in one's people, in one's art, was apparently universal. Clashin, I thought your world was called RNA. Humans like to name things before they know whether they already have names or not. I walked over and took the seat opposite Akshat. I've heard humans call y'all the Trappist G. They do like to make it seem as though they created everything, don't they? I didn't know what to say to that. I'd heard elders grumble such things, but didn't expect it from a traveled performer like Akshat, one who had been lifted as I had up into the stars by the grace of human generosity. They lit our homes, cleaned our water, and taught us about the universe. I did not understand how ones who gave so much could ever be called thieves. What was your song about? I said, trying to change the subject. He looked over the edge of the balcony toward the stage. It was as if he were watching himself, as if his voice still filled the room. It was a very old song about a battle of perfections. The humans call them gods. They fight in the sky for control of light. That sounds fascinating. Most beings have myths about eclipses. Akshat shrugged, but the motion was exaggerated, clearly something he'd picked up. I was about to ask him how long he'd been performing when his eyes jumped from me to the clear door and traced a path down the unseeable corridor beyond the opaque walls. I'm sorry, but we will have to cut our talk short. Your guide just got in the lift. He's heading this way. Akshat stood and grabbed the back of his chair, which collapsed upward into his palm like magic. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. We were supposed to sit and laugh and discuss our homeworlds. He was supposed to tell me how amazing his life had been, performing all over the galaxy, seeing unimaginable worlds and people, how he wouldn't trade it for anything. Wait, I said, not sure what I wanted him to wait for, grasping for that one question I needed him to answer. I'm sorry, I really need to. What is your favorite place? I said. Of all the places you've been, which was the most wonderful? At first, Akshat seemed surprised. His mouth sat open in that perfect circle and his eyes locked on mine. Then he closed his mouth and took one sweeping stride back from the door toward me. He placed his living, rasping palm on my cheek and lifted my hand to rest on his. Home, he said. They take you everywhere but home. Then he left. A few moments later, Ruya came in and told me that he'd spoken to Akshat's guide and that he was unfortunately unavailable. I stormed past him without a word and went up to my room. I was angry and disappointed, and nothing was right. I thought that maybe if I slept, it would all be better tomorrow.
That's clapping and cheering.
Thank you, Storm. Zach, would you like to share a little bit of your story with us?
Sure. Let me start by trying to do this maneuver where we show the picture. It's never easy, but not much glare. So that's the picture for the story that I'm about to read. The story is called As Able the Heir. I'm gonna be dangerous and try to pick up in the middle of the story, so you'll have even less of an idea of what I'm talking about. And basically, before I do that, I'll just say the story, where I'm picking up in the story, it's about a landmine decommission expert, but think of it more in the way that you have a drone plane operator. So the main character, Erto, is in like far away from the fighting, like working underground, and he's in communication with the drone, but the drone has a bit of a personality, and he's just tried to ask if he could sort of hang out with the drone, and the drone said no. So he's about to leave and go back to his room, and I'm going to pick up there. Erto pulled his arms out of the tongue and rubbed his eyes. Why had he said any of that to Dart? He must have sounded desperate. The low red shade of the small operational suite shifted then to its obnoxious white floodlights, dragging Erto to his feet. The door raised, and he climbed out onto the frigid gunmetal catwalk of the OPSEC. 100 other orbs, just like Erto's compartment, lined either side of the walkway, their rusting curves obscured by perspiring pipes and webs of fiber optic cabling. Large AC units chilled the massive chamber down to uncomfortable temperatures to ensure no ops could be botched by overheated machinery, at least on Erto's end. All of this hung above a deep black chasm, the lower level of which supposedly housed an emergency water reservoir. Erto could not see the bottom. He strode quickly toward the exit, handing his OPSEC key pass through a kiosk window to a woman cloaked in a heavy winter jacket. Shivering through an Arctic shroud and shouldering a wall of plastic strips, Erto climbed his way to the tall, minimal white halls of the surface concourse. He passed all manner of military and corporate officials, most of whom couldn't be bothered to look up from their tablets. It was all right there. Erto had nothing to say to them. After being denied the conversation he wanted, Erto simply needed to disappear into his bed. His appetite was gone. The soft, shuffling malaise of the war complex reminded him a great deal of those lonely ghost-hour monorail journeys from his old coding job in the capital city to the coalition-subsidized apartment hive he called home. Over years, the city's endless flurry had turned opaque in Erto's eyes. The crowd was a form of isolation unto itself, the bitter truth being that beneath the deafening metallic grind of the city's infernal infrastructure, no one was really trying to talk anyways. Erto had little trouble abandoning the churning capital for the less exacerbating military frontier. A din of silence hung around the war complex with startling sincerity. The quiet here, not enforced by authority or drowned by chaos, was sublime. Sometimes it was easy to forget altogether that there was war going on. The complex was so far from the fighting that the war zone disappeared around the curve of the earth, making the conflict as invisible to the naked eye as it was silent to the ear. The door to his quarters in the subcom slid open with a satisfying swish, and immediately the harsh spots in the ceiling illuminated his Spartan accommodations. A bed, a chair, and a desk, each fused to the rigid gray walls and floor. He hated thinking of this cell as a home, but it was all he had known for months. Kill the lights, Erto told the room before falling into his bed. Facing his pillow, he began counting the 26 mines they had removed that night, hoping that he could find proof that Dart was off by one. Dart's the robot. Despite the photographic evidence to the contrary. It would be so great to catch Dart in a fallacy like this and watch, well, listen anyways, to his friend try to compute his way out of this mistake. As he pondered each mental image, the world began to slow down, and he was able to take the deepest breath he had taken in hours. Sleep was imminent. Instead, a square of light appeared on the wall across from him, and a loud ringing vibrated Erto's room. He sat upright in bed and read the message on the screen. Answer, answer, he said. The screen went white, then black, and then filled with a low pixel count video of a young woman at a desk in what looked like Erto's capital city apartment. Erto, how are you? She said. Very tired, my love, he replied. Oh no, were you sleeping? I didn't mean to wake you, she said. Calendar says you're usually off work around now. No, I am. It was a long one today. I'm sorry to hear that, baby. Do you want to talk about it? Erto looked at the clock inset on a nearby wall. It would be dawn soon locally, and he couldn't remember what time it was in the capital. You wouldn't want to hear it, he says. Oh, please, she crossed her arms. What's the point of having special access if you aren't going to talk to me? Erto let out a sigh and tried to smile. Is that mate? He asked, pointing at the cup of tea next to her hand. Your mother had some sent to your apartment, she says. She left you a message. Tell me about it, the tea. It's warm and smooth and very sweet, like you like it, she said. It's not my favorite, but I get it. It's fine. You prefer it green? I prefer it coffee, she said, and laughed as she sipped from the cup. But I was thinking of you, so I thought I'd have some. What else did my mother's message say? Something about you not dying, she said. Do you want the full transcript? No, he said, letting out a small laugh. How many times do I have to explain to her that I'm not anywhere near the fighting? No one is, she responded. Dart is, Erto said, rubbing his temples. She put the cup down on the desk. Dart? She asked. Yes, my partner. We've been working together for a couple of months. I know, she said. But isn't he a drone? It's not like that, Erto responded. It's not. Well, what is it like? She asked. Let's not talk about it, Erto said, falling to his side on the bed. Fine, I can tell you about my day. Okay. Work was tough, commute was tough. There was nothing good on TV, she said. Then I stayed in, hoping to talk to you. I'm sorry. I know it's tough in the capital as well. I don't mean to ignore you. I'm just tense. Then relax. It's all right. The conversation broke for a while, and Erto's heavy eyelids began to close, the glow of the screen falling over his face. You don't have to talk, she said, finally. Okay, he mumbled, half asleep. You just have to listen. Erto's eyes opened again, and he watched her start to undo her blouse. Her bosom loosened, and he imagined he could reach his hand through the screen and sink into her milky white skin. Are you listening? She asked. Yes, he said. Yes, what? Yes, ma'am, he corrected, starting to sit up. Then get up on your feet. Erto rose to attention and tried to wipe the sleep from his eyes. Put your hands down. Yes, ma'am. Now take it off, all of it, she said, undoing one more button on her blouse. Erto quickly removed his clothes and folded them on the corner of his bed just as she liked them. He stood again at attention in the crystalline light of the screen and waited, his body cold and warm all at once. Are you ready, boy? She asked. Yes, ma'am. Then listen very closely. That's where I'll stop.
Thank you both for sharing with us. This year's anthology is particularly good. It's great you guys are just giving a taste, because I recommend to our audience, I've read this book twice now, and it was just as good the second time around. So we're going to move into our Q&A, and we welcome any audience questions. You're welcome to put them in the chat, and we will try and get to all of them. For starters, I have a couple questions that are individual to each of you about your stories and your lives, but I also have some questions that I'd like to ask both of you. To start with, and this one is for both of you, we'll start with Zack and then move back to Storm. What made you decide to enter the Writers of the Future contest, and how many times did you enter before winning?
Good question. This is going to sound, there's some people here from Writers of the Future, and they're probably not going to like hearing this, but it's one on a list of many, many markets that I was actively sending stories to. Starting in about 2017, I started sending stories and trying to build up an idea of how the science fiction market works. No idea. No one ever talks to you about that. I don't know. Storm could speak to if people talk about this at like the master's level, like when you're getting an MFA. But I have a minor in creative writing, and we never talked about anything about the business world of writing whatsoever. So it's kind of on my own, learning through Googling what markets there were to send things to. Writers of the Future was one of those markets, and I always had in the back of my mind, well, you know, it would be really cool to win that. I know that the contest has, I heard just before we came on that apparently 20,000 people or something like that entered the year that we were submitting. So that's a lot of people. And I thought, you know, if I get published in some other markets and then I'm not able to, I'm not eligible for Writers of the Future anymore, that'll be that. If I get into Writers of the Future, that'll be that also. I got published in Asimov's, and I was like, ooh, if I sell one more thing, no more Writers of the Future. And then the next thing I sold was Writers of the Future. So just serendipitous. I slipped in there right at the end. The thing about Writers of the Future is that it gave me, every other market's kind of random. You don't really know when it's going to be open, or it's open all the time, so there's not much rush to submit to it. Writers of the Future is very much every quarter you have an opportunity to turn something in. And having that, the thing that sticks out about Writers of the Future before I won, obviously, the thing that stuck out was that that's a marker. You know, I should have something done or something that I've finished before that's been re-edited is ready to go out again every 3 months to send. And so I submitted probably, I don't know, maybe six to eight times before I won with this story. and that's over. But 6 to 8 times is like a year and a half, or to something like that, 2 years. So, yeah.
And Storm?
So I started submitting just because it was a thing that there were levels to, where I could say, like, where you could track your progress almost. Like there were honorable mentions and silver honorable mentions and so on and so forth. And so it was a way to maybe see if you are progressing or getting better, if you do better in the next one you did in the last one. And it was, like Zach said, another market that I could submit to that would pay me for my work. Because I think that's important for artists to be paid for their work. So yeah, I started submitting just because, like him, like in undergrad, they don't talk about the business of writing at all. And I think mostly that's because in undergrad, you're almost always taught by someone who's writing literary fiction, and there is no business of publishing. Like it's just are you a professor? Do you have a university that will publish your lit book? Yes, no. That's the end of the road. That's it. Or are you writing satire? Are you witty? Like those are the other things that you can do. But science fiction and fantasy and genre writing in general is much more of a constructed, tiered business. And so I think that was something that, having Chip to kind of guide me, which was kind of helpful, and kind of like, one, he's 77, so it was much different than he was when he was coming up, and he was immediately successful from the age of 20 on. So his world in publishing was very much different than the one that we currently exist in. But he was still very helpful about, get your work out there, get your name out there. There are tiers basically to venues and how many people read them and how much your name gets out there, and work from the top down. And Writers of the Future was up there towards the top. So they were one of the ones that would get my first round of submissions for my stories, which is strange because you end up revising things more as you keep getting them back. So I feel like the more you move down the list, the more you fine-tuned the work for these lower markets, which is odd, but
I'm stuck in that all the time. I know exactly what you mean.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And but I think I submitted 4 times before I won. I got a silver honorable mention, then I got nothing, and then I got a finalist, and then I won.
Cool. Well, congratulations to you both. One of the coolest things about the Writers of the Future contest is it's also the Illustrators of the Future contest. And so when you have one of the winning stories, you get teamed up with the winning illustrators to illustrate your story. I was wondering, for both of you, and we'll start with Storm and move back to Zach, what was it like having your works illustrated by the winning illustrators, and what were your reactions to getting to see this work for the first time?
I thought it was very cool. I had actually before this recently had my other story illustrated, the one that was an Interzone. My story Viren was illustrated, so it wasn't my first time having something illustrated, but the process by which we get to see the artwork was so structured that it had this nice, cool reveal to it, where like we were being treated to this thing that we got to enjoy. And because the art was like the artists were the other winners, there was that cool kind of duality as well. And for me personally, it was seeing how An Lee, who illustrated my story, chose to depict a character that I never described physically, which is the point of view character. So that was very interesting for me personally.
Yeah. I've never had anyone illustrate a story that I've written before. I have some really awkward in my bedroom, my childhood bedroom at home, that I think my dad works in now because of coronavirus. Secretly hidden in there, Dad, if you're here, are some comic books I wrote that are extremely inappropriate when I was in middle school. That was the closest I've ever been to having my writing be illustrated. Prior to now, don't go looking for them because you'll find other stuff that you should know about. And it was amazing. It's amazing because I kept thinking like the vision in my mind of what the story looked like was specific. I mean, I wrote it, right? I kind of had an idea of what things would be. Maybe it was dirtier than what the actual illustration looks like. More mechanical. I don't know. I had certain images in my mind, and yet when Brock, who is the Brock Aguirre, who is the artist for my story, when I saw his picture come up, and they didn't tell us which ones were our stories when they were introduced to us. You get to have that sort of shock of realizing, oh, that's mine. That's my story. When I saw the art for it, I knew immediately that it was mine because he had captured the tone of the story, the loneliness and the depression that kind of is one of the main themes of the story, and the sort of post-traumatic stress kind of stuff that's going on. It's written all over this character's face, even though he's much more cartoony than I would have imagined. And the colors that he chose were this like purples and blues that really spoke to the fact that the whole story takes place in the middle of the night, underground, right? And so it totally spoke to it, but it was a completely different filter through which to pour the themes of the story. So it's very cool in that way, and I hope every writer gets the opportunity to have that happen to them at least once, because it really is awesome.
All right, we've got a question from the audience for Storm. This question is from Gabriel. Since your story is written in first person, was it an interpretation of a personal experience, or could you tell us about what may have inspired the idea?
What inspired the idea was a talk that Chip was giving at ReaderCon one year. That's when I originally wrote the source kind of germ for the story, which was a flash fiction originally. It wasn't expanded to a full short story until Cast of Wonders asked me to expand the story, and then didn't buy it. But I think the first person was, as I wrote the story, it became more about kind of reflecting something that I have never and could never experience. And that was kind of cultural appropriation and, feeling alien and things like that, because I'm a straight, white, cisgendered male in America. It's really, there's not a lot of opportunity for me to ever experience those things directly. So I think the fact that I chose a young female alien was purposeful in that I was really inverting a lot of the things that are me to create a voice that I had to kind of invert myself into. And so I think that's more why I chose that point of view and how I went about constructing that character.
And I've got a question for Zack regarding your story. Your story follows the logical conclusion of totally automated warfare. Could you speak to why you made this choice and any issues that came up because of it, that potentially became plot points?
Interesting you say that. My original idea was more about the automated warfare, and then of course, when you think about making machines and artificial intelligences, it's like, what is interesting about them, really, other than how they relate to humans, right? If the machines just existed without us, there wouldn't really be much relevancy for a story. And I started thinking, who are the humans in this world? How are they affected by the sort of lack of connection to the fact that they're even making war? And does it still cause the same sort of effects on soldiers, quote unquote soldiers, right? He's sitting in a room somewhere, but can you still have those same sort of effects? Is the human experience that fluid? Is the relationship, will we always sort of create these, will these themes always manifest when there's humans involved? So you have just robots fighting each other, and still this guy develops PTSD because of how the robots are made, which is by human hands. It's kind of just, I ended up tumbling down that well while working on the story. And it really became about Erto and his depression and loneliness, more so than it was about the fact that we're going towards fully automated war. The other thing about real world fully automated war is that it's more likely to not even be all that physical. Like this was sort of a fantastical physical version of that, but more likely we're going to get into kind of like data war, where it's all sort of happening in the cloud, and then that has downstream effects on people. But no matter what, no matter how automated and perpetual war becomes, there always has to be a downstream effect on the people, and that's kind of where the story is. And if that wasn't there, it would just be sort of although of course one post-apocalypse we could imagine is all the people are dead and the machines are just fighting each other on loop, right? Which somebody can go write that story. um, so
And
yeah.
to follow that question, the character, both the robot and the human character in your story, are cleaning up mines. And I wondered if you were inspired by some of the travesties in Southeast Asia with mine cleanups that are still needing to go on.
Yeah, actually, I would think I was more in. It just so happens that I had just prior to starting to write that story been listening to the Hardcore History podcast. If anyone's ever listened to that, Dan Carlin's Hardcore History, and I was listening to the World War I podcast, and he talks extensively. Now, this is a 26-hour long podcast, so you know he talks extensively in that about how they're still kind of like what you're saying about Southeast Asia. They're still cleaning up bombs in France now. Like it's been 100 years. There's still stuff buried in the ground there. Uh, so I don't know that I was directly inspired by that. It was very indirect. I'd heard that, and then I started thinking about what kind of things, what kind of seemingly pointless task. Like there is a utility to what Dart and Airto do, but also it's robots. So like, who cares that there's mines? Just build more robots. So I kind of thought about how mines are so dangerous to humans in the real world, but in this context, it's like there's a pointlessness to what he does that reinforces how he's feeling about the world, which I think that's really what drew me to it. Um, Also, though, we should try to clean up those mines. That's also an important thing to point out.
Here's one for Storm. Your story speaks to the human arrogance of thinking that we own things just because we've named them. Can you speak to this concept and what place you think humans might hold if we enter a galactic civilization?
I think the idea of owning things to name them, like naming things, owning things by naming them, I think is more, it's kind of a general kind of colonialist statement about like renaming things that already have names and people that already have like tribal names and associations and identities and just remaking them as we see fit. But I think the other question in terms of like if humanity entered some kind of intergalactic community, I think our place in it really depends on at what point we enter. Like there's I forget what the theory is called, but it's almost the basis of the theory is that whoever discovers star travel first is going to be perpetually in control of whatever starfaring community that exists, because you lay claim to all these resources and places and you gain all this knowledge first, and it would be really hard to upset that kind of dominance as being any of the other, like even being able to develop your own starfaring technology that would pretty much be at the whims of these people that already have it. So I think that um and it's kind of in the same group of theories as like the why haven't we found aliens and things like that yet. It's like there's this race to be the first species that really masters this like starfaring, this space travel, and then everyone after that will always be perpetually a more and more distant second. And I think it depends on if we win the race or not, assuming there are other sentient species out there, which I think there probably are, but there's another
You don't
troubling
think you
theory
don't think
about that.
you don't think space is infinite enough for that to not end up actually being a problem? Because I'm thinking about I'm thinking about our asteroid belt has
Mhm.
so much material in it that like we would basically never run out of the kind of resources you can get, like different kinds of metals and minerals and things.
Well, I think because you talk about space as space, but once you talk about intergalactic space, like I think you always are going to talk about a galactic community because traversing intergalactic space is like a whole different, like it's orders of magnitude greater than traveling between stars within a galaxy. Like traveling between galaxies is something else completely. So I think we're always dealing with the finite idea of our galaxy. Like, um, but I think that, you know, as you become, as species become more advanced and technology becomes more energy intensive, that there's going to be an equal escalation in the exhaustion of resources. So I think there's always going to be fight over resources, whatever those resources may be, and if we've discovered all of them yet or not. But I think that'll always be, that resources will always be an issue.
Sure. Especially depending on what the resource is, I guess. Like maybe water. This is like the classic, but that water is super rare. But maybe metal is like super easy to come by, so it doesn't matter. But
Yeah.
I had another question based on the earlier question, which is this idea of naming things. Like I totally understand the in our context here, the colonial implications of renaming things, right? But also underneath that is that it's a very human compulsion to name things, period. So there's a culture clash or like a justice kind of thing happening between cultures here. But this idea of naming things, do you think it would extend? Do you think other species would even bother with that? Do you think it wouldn't matter to potential other types of environments?
I don't know. I think identity and signification are pretty universal. If you look at dolphins and whales and ravens, like they've all been found to have names. Like you have to be able to identify things that you're, if you have communication, there has to be identification. So I think that naming things is one of those universal things. It has to be a universal thing, at least as we conceptualize communication.
Well, that's the thing, as we conceptualize,
Sure.
and all of our evolutionary ancestry leading up to us. Like, I wonder if octopi work that way. I don't know.
They might have colors for things instead. There's a really wonderful Ursula K. Le Guin short story called a piece of flash fiction called "She Unnames Them," which goes into this topic. It's very interesting. She takes it on in sort of a biblical way. Um, but Zack, I wanted to go back to your story for a moment here. Your story focuses heavily on the relationships between AI and humans. If and when we achieve AI, what sort of new relationships do you think are going to arise for humans? And do you think we will try to use AI to replace the types of relationships that we do have?
I mean, it's already happened. It's already happening. You know, look at. Not only was it happening before COVID, and I honestly didn't know COVID was going to happen when I wrote this story. But gosh, is it? You know, it feels current now when I read the part in the story I read today about how he's sort of reminiscing about being on trains and nobody looking at each other, and now he's just kind of in this quarantined room by himself. Uh, I wish I could have told people this was coming. We could have done something about it. But yeah, I think we're already there. I don't think it takes very much for people to imprint upon objects, you know, project their own personality onto objects, and then to therefore make those objects part of themselves. Or for people, you know, who feel awkward around other people, right? You mentioned before, I'm a therapist. A lot of my clients have social phobia, which is, you know, an anxiety disorder, being around people. It's easier to play, you know, I'm not a huge video game nerd, but oh god, there's this free
World of
game.
Warcraft.
World of Warcraft is the classic example, but now there's like 20 World of Warcrafts or more that are, you know, massively multiplayer online things where it's more comfortable to be behind the screen and sort of having vague connections with real people, but the connections with the real people and the connections with the NPCs, the non-playable characters, the line between that is getting thinner and thinner, because it's just as good to sort of project yourself onto a character, or project even just a part of yourself, right? Because we're all so fractured inside. To project one of the fractured pieces of yourself, of your internal self, onto a character, and to be able to interact with it in a video game, or with even with like a chat bot. Every time we do one of these talks, we end up talking about therapy chat bots and how that's a thing already, right? It's very easy for people to do that because it's comforting, because it's being with yourself and not necessarily being with like an authentic part of yourself, just being with a part of yourself that's easy to be with. So we're already there. And I think as our robots and our AIs get more and more convincing, as we sort of cross over start being able to start needing really, really strong Turing tests to prove that robots aren't people, or start passing the what's it called, the uncanny valley. I don't know if you all have been looking into or just sort of keep up on the deep fake community and all the very, very, very creepy videos that they make where they swap actors' faces with other faces, or just make wholly new audio of Joe Biden talking, or whatever it is. I mean, we're right at the cusp of that. And that technology, mixed with how easy I think it is for people to imprint upon or project upon um, objects, things that aren't people, we're going to all kinds of relationships at a certain point could be moved, for some people, not for everybody, but all types of relationships could be I'm trying to think of the right word here, outsourced, could be outsourced to artificial intelligence and other things. Yeah.
We've got a question for Storm from the audience. This one's from Kim. What was the reason for deciding not to describe the main character?
So I think for me, it was just a kind of a stylistic thing, and it's very much tied into the point of view. Um, I try to, when I choose a point of view, to remain very true to it. And if I'm going to stay in close psychic distance with the character, I try to do that. And whenever you're writing in first person, it's always a very awkward transition to gain a self description. So whenever I'm writing in first person, I just tend to avoid that, because we don't describe ourselves often. We don't think of ourselves in descriptive terms. We just are us. So I think that whenever I'm writing in first person, and usually close third person, I tend to avoid self-describing my point of view character.
That's a great answer. Zack, your story speaks to technology leading towards isolation. Could you expand on that concept a little bit and how you used it in your story?
Sure. It's a double-edged sword, technology. It's like, to give a very current example. I think when COVID ends, in terms of when people are able to go back to work, probably a lot of people won't really ever go back to work. Not because it's still dangerous necessarily, but because this is easier. What we're doing right now, I mean, what we're doing right now would be impossible if not for this technology that we have. We couldn't all just sort of like, all the people who are here, all spread all over the country, aren't going to show up for a brief author visit at a bookstore. It's, for me, you're in Joshua Tree and I'm in Maryland. Like, this never could happen. So, and for people who are working right now and realizing, oh, I can get just as much work done at home as I could if I was there, maybe even more, and there's no commute, and we're not, the environment's looking better in some places because of that. It's like, a lot of that's not going to come back, at least not soon, at least not until there's some sort of capitalist reason for it to come back. So it's easier, and it's also, it's like I said, it's a double-edged sword. It's easier for us to do this, but it's also therefore easier for us to be isolated from each other. And going back to what I was saying before, it's also easy for a lot of people, to come up with coping skills, adapt as animals do, to adapt to the situation, to make ourselves comfortable, right? So I'm spending quite a lot of time here in my pillow fort, right? And I'm finding ways to feel sane here, even though you mentioned that I'm a musician, but I haven't played. I mean, I've played a couple outdoor shows this year, but really that whole wing of my life is just gone for the time being. But I found ways to adapt where I'm not necessarily around all those people all the time, doing other things and feeling fine. it's basically we're incentivized to start using this technology, which pushes us further apart in a lot of ways, and then we adapt to feel sane in that environment, and that adaptation can keep going and going, and so maybe a couple generations down the line people are more comfortable like this. Or maybe another evolutionary way of looking at it is maybe people who do better in isolation will be more successful, and then you get more and more people who do well in isolation, and we just kind of evolve in that direction alongside our technology.
And Storm, I wanted to ask you, you studied with Chip Delaney. For those in the audience who don't know Chip Delaney, Samuel Delaney, he's one of the, I think, 36 grandmasters of science fiction, a very serious writer, one of the first people to introduce the issues of sex into science fiction, for instance, and done in a really cool way. But what was it like studying with Chip, and what was the most important lesson you feel like he taught you?
I think it was really, it was amazing studying with Chip. One, because of who he is, and then two, well, who he is as a writer, and then two, because of who he is as a person. He's very approachable and warm. And it was the first time I went to see him in his office. I had to like work up to like, I'm going to go see Chip in his office and do that today. It was on like my list. And so I did that, and we sat and had lunch. But the chair I'm sitting in his office was very messy. Chair I'm sitting in has his Grandmaster Award in a frame underneath it. It's not even hung up. You're just sitting on top of his Grandmaster Award, and he's just talking to you like a person. And so just that experience and like humanizing somebody that you find to be a very rare and powerful talent writer like that was important for me. Because I don't know, it just, you don't think of people that you aspire to be like as being like that, but the most important lesson he taught me, I think, is something that, and it was important because it's one of those things that you realize was true as soon as you hear somebody say it to you, and that is that writing is a competition. If you want to be a writer, if you want to be a professional writer, you are constantly, perpetually competing with everyone else who wants to do that. Not only that, you are competing with everyone else who's ever done that. You're competing with William Faulkner and Hemingway and Chip and Ursula Le Guin for people's time. You have to be worth people's time to open your book and read your words as opposed to somebody else's. And if you're not going to acknowledge it as a competition, if you're not going to put that kind of work and attention and effort into mastering that craft, you can't do it. And I think that was, it's one of those things that you don't think about. You think of writing as art and writing as escape and writing as entertainment, but you can't really do it professionally unless you acknowledge it as a competition and understand the stakes you're competing for, and that's people's time.
I actually really like, so Gabriel put in the comments that it's grim, but I had a different reaction to that. I've never heard that before, but the part that really stuck out to me was that you have to take it seriously because you're vying for people's attention, and attention / time is like the most valuable thing in a person's life because it is limited. Like it just is. It's the state of being alive that's limited. And so if you're not going to approach the writing, this is what I'm taking from what you just said, Storm. If you're not going to approach the writing as though it is this competition that you need to win, and put the amount of effort into it that, like, an Olympic swimmer needs to put in to win at the Olympics, then are you really writing something that is worth the time, the very, very valuable time of each individual that would potentially read your story? So it's not really grim to me. It's like a call to arms, really. Yeah.
I tend to think of that in terms of, reading it's a time-based art form. So when you pick up a book, it's a commitment. You have to commit 12 hours of your life to read it. Some of us read fast, some of us read slow, but we're asking for a major commitment from our readers. And I got to say, with Writers of the Future 36, you won't be disappointed because there isn't a bad story in there. Zack, I also wanted to ask you about the human tendency to anthropomorphize and how you used this as a device in the story.
Yeah, it's kind of like what I said in the previous answer, which is that, it's easy for us to do that. Like you said, the tendency for us to do that. And I kind of want, to be perfectly honest, I wanted to create some drama with that, right? That seemed to be, again, going back to what I said earlier about what are the downstream consequences of this kind of warfare on people, right? And I think I made it I tweaked it just enough to make it kind of like obviously a bad idea to make Dart so talkative and so likable. But it's not outside the realm of possibility for us to make war machines that talk back to us and for us to get attached to them, just like we might get attached to a car, not Knight Rider, but just any car that's maybe out in anybody's garage right now, to just sort of have a relationship with that thing, right? Things, anything you can have. As a musician, I have lots of instruments laying around here, some of which I have a stronger connection to, some of which I have less of a connection to, but it, in some way, because of what I do with that thing, it becomes an extension of who I am. It's an instrument by which I am able to express myself or to interact with the world. And it's really easy for that to become part of the, again, the self concept, to have sort of aspects of what you like about yourself or dislike about yourself projected onto it, right? Like, I play the banjo. That's a weird choice, but that's kind of like why I like to play the banjo. If I'm being like brutally honest, I picked up the banjo because I thought no one else around here plays the banjo, which obviously is totally egocentric. Plenty of people in Maryland play the banjo. We are below the Mason-Dixon line, but the the point is, I'm projecting some part of myself onto it, and I'm attached to that banjo. A lot of my instruments have names and things, and it's like, what? Why? It's just a piece of wood with strings attached to it. So basically, I was using it as a I was using it as a device because I think it's maybe not as, I think a lot of times objects in science fiction stories are like, it's so cool, like look at this crazy idea that it manifests. And I was trying to look at sort of the more emotional side of the relationships that people have with the sort of the MacGuffins, so to speak, in the science fiction story, that you could imprint upon that, and it would be an important part of your life. It's not just it's not just the King Arthur's sword. It's like, what is the relationship between King Arthur and his sword in the stone? That's fantasy, not sci-fi, but you know what I'm saying.
And Storm, I have one more question for you. We've got another audience question, and then I want to ask you both a question to wrap it up for this evening. But Storm, you also work as a slush reader for Clark's World magazine. How has this changed and informed your writing, being that first barrier between the writers and editors?
And what is your favorite slushy flavor?
I think that, so it was a tremendous help when I started out slush reading, just because Clarksworld is such a major market, and being able to look, and so first it's a confidence thing. You're like, I am on some level deciding whether or not these people get to be considered for publication. And so there was almost an ethical issue for me in the beginning. It's like, am I good enough to do this? Like, who am I? I've published like 2 stories anywhere in the world at that point that I started. But it was, it was just trusting the fact that what good writing looks like, and if something's good enough to have somebody else look at it, like that should be apparent. So I think that just getting a grasp for what, understanding that I know what good writing looks like, building that confidence that I know this, but then also thinking about myself as a reader, like what were some things that I would be reading that would turn me off just to keep reading? Like, what were some things that annoyed me, bothered me? What were some things that were not just personal style kind of bugaboos, which is something that you kind of want to push down a little bit when you're reading for a market, because you're more reading on their guidelines, but just functionally as a reader, like what were things I didn't like, and then being like, I shouldn't do that in my own writing because I didn't like it. I can't treat my own writing as an exception to the rule. I have to come up with these rules and try to follow them, and if I'm going to break them, I have to have a very good reason, and I have to think that the outcome is successful. So I think that providing that perspective was very helpful for me, and growing as a short fiction writer.
And
and
Zach,
I don't like slushies.
I knew you were going to say that. I knew it. I knew it. I don't even know why I asked. That's totally fine. That's the best answer.
Zach, we have a question from you for you from the audience. This one is from Robin. Does your background as a therapist influence your writing, and if so, how?
Everything we do influences the stuff that we make. So if I was a long haul truck driver, that would probably influence what I was writing. If I was Storm, that would influence what I was writing, right? Yes. And in fact, in this particular case, there is a more direct influence in that when I originally wrote the story, it coincided with when I started my my graduate program in couple and family therapy. And most likely, the reason that I started shifting to thinking about PTSD in the main character, as opposed to thinking about laser beams and or whatever I was thinking about for the robot warfare, was because I was swimming in research and working with people who had trauma histories. And now, I I, tr- I wish I could come up with a really good hook for a like a therapist detective series that I could sell millions of copies of. Maybe that's in my future. I don't know. Um, but at the very least, I definitely try to use some of the experiences of empathy that I have when I'm working with clients, and like what I do during the day is I sit with people and dig into dig into the rawest parts of their life and like hold a space for them to do that. And being around that all day, all the time, definitely gives you a lot. And by the way, the people that I've worked with have been extremely diverse also. So very far outside of my experience, kind of like what Storm was talking about earlier, but how do you tap into that? Being around that all the time definitely has an influence on how I am, how I'm going to write a character. If I write a female character, how I'm going to do that, right? Mostly by not thinking, oh, I'm writing a female character, right? Of course, but if I'm writing any character whose experience is different than mine, drawing on that feeling of empathy and the things that really connect us, not the sort of what you imagine people might be feeling based on what they look like or what you assume about them, but the deeper connections. I hope that made sense at the end there. Yeah.
All right. Thank you both so much. I want to end this talk with a question that's for both of you. Now that you've both won the Writers of the Future contest, which is obviously prestigious and a great feather in your cap and a boost to your career, what's next and what current projects are you working on? Zach, if you want to go first, and then we'll move into Storm.
Sure. My current project is myself because I'm in a PhD program right now also, so it's just a lot of work. But to answer the question that you're actually asking, while I'm doing that, I'm continuing to work on lots of different short stories. I tend to have several. I don't know what to say. I was gonna say blank in the oven, but for some reason I can't finish this metaphor right now.
Buns.
Cakes? What did you say? Buns? What do
Buns.
people? What did you say?
Buns.
Buns? Okay, I've got
I guess
several
that's for
buns in
babies,
the
isn't
oven. I
it?
guess
Buns
that's
in
the
the
thing.
oven is babies.
Biscuits? I don't know. Do you put biscuits in an oven? Yeah, you put biscuits. I don't know. I've got several turkeys in the oven right now. That was themed for the holiday season. And I have sort of an arbitrary goal in mind of how many stories I'd like to have professionally published before I will allow myself to like really dive into the novel that I want to write. And I have broken that rule several times by working on that novel when I should be writing papers for the PhD program. The novel is about a break in reality that happens in the Pacific Northwest when the Cascadian subduction zone decides to do its thing and flood the area. And the main star of the story is a dog that is starting to talk. And there's a lot more to it than that, but I'll leave it there. That's what I'm working on right now.
And Storm, what's next for you?
I also had a goal in mind for how many major publications I wanted to have before I started writing on a novel. But I had to fudge it a little bit, mostly because SFWA keeps moving the goalposts on me. Inner Zone counted until not too long ago. Andromeda Spaceways counted until not too long ago. There's the Future counted until not too long ago. So, and Apex, which I've also published in, still counts. So,
Do you have a big Excel spreadsheet, Storm, with all of these submissions on it? Do you keep track of it that way?
Yes, because I don't want to simultaneously submit when I'm not allowed to.
Right.
So I have a big Excel sheet. I still have some short stories I worked on before I started. So I've decided to write my novel now. I'm currently writing my novel, and I'm about 300 pages in. And I still have some short stories that are out bouncing around from what I completed and was happy with before I decided to start. But pretty much I'm working on that novel. I've gone back to novel reading, which is interesting since when I was from about the time I was 20 till I won, I read almost exclusively short stories because that's what I was writing. And I like to read the form that I'm writing, mostly because I want to keep track of the markets I'm submitting to. So I'm reading those markets constantly. But now I'm reading novels again. So I just finished the Broken Earth series by N.K. Jemisin. I went and read Lord of the Rings. I've been a huge Game of Thrones fan forever. I read Chip's Never Yawn series. And now I'm reading Gideon the Ninth. So I'm back into novels, and I'm getting more comfortable with the structure. One of the biggest things, my brother is my main kind of collaborator right now. He reads my chapters and gives me notes back. He keeps telling me I need to let myself go and like build the world, and I keep wanting to shrink everything because it's a short fiction habit. It's like my own hand striking my other knuckles with a ruler. Like, you need to cut this, you need to be concise, but I need to let my hair down. I need to world build. But I am going to take a break and read a short story, which is by Zack and Asimov's. I got my copy today. And then I'm also going to take a break and read my friend's novel from Temple, State of the Nation, by David Jackson Ambrose. I'm going to read that as well, though that is a novel. But I'm taking a break to read a short story for Zack. But after that, I'm back to novels and Gideon the Ninth and Necromancers in Space.
I feel so special right now. No idea.
But I am working on my novel, and I do hope to have it. I won't have my first draft done by the time I actually go to the Writers of the Future event. That's my personal deadline. I want to pretty much write 300 more pages by then. So I need to probably get going.
I love the tremble in your voice at the end of that sentence.
Because I've written about 300 pages in about a year, and I have about 5 months to do the next 300. So
you can do it. You can do it. What you need is a AI beta reader who will only give you good feedback.
Oh dear. Well, gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us tonight here at Space Cowboy Books. Thanks to all the folks at Writers of the Future. Congratulations on your win, well deserved. And when the event comes around, I hope to see you at the gala. Thank you to our audience for joining us. There's a link in the chat to both of their websites, as well as to where you can purchase this great anthology. And hope to see you all again soon. Thank you so much.